Good evening. Hello. I think that's us live. Yeah, there we go. Just give it a moment while people connect. Hope you had a good week. It's been a fun week here. It's been a week of celebrations, milestones, all the festivities of remembering another year gone. The counting gets harder the older we get, I guess. But it's a lot of fun. If you want something to put the fun back into birthday celebrations, have a small child in the house who's got a deep sense of the fact that really every party, every celebration, there ought to be something in it for him. That certainly made things really quite wonderful. That's sort of where I want to start tonight. I want to start with some remembering of God's faithfulness, some remembering of all the miles of my own journey and our journey as a family, but also some of the things that we're experiencing right now and some of the promises that we have as a group of God's people, this community that we call Harvest Church. I can still remember many years ago now in the run up to my 40th birthday, so it's a long time ago, going for my one of my regular checkups with the transplant specialist, and we sort of went through the usual unpleasantness of testing and blood tests and all the rest of it. And when we sat down, and he said to me, he said, "Well, it's been a while now since you had this transplant, and it's going to come to an end pretty soon, I think. So we need to start getting ready and thinking about physical conditioning, ready for you to be able to either go back onto dialysis or potentially have another transplant." And I sort of heard him out, and he explained how somebody with my condition, there was no real expectation that the transplant would last more than maybe 10 years at a push. And so things were becoming urgent in his opinion. Well, like I said, that's a very, very long time ago now. By the faithfulness of God and just the amazing grace that God has, I'm still here. And I'm no nearer now to needing a new transplant than I was then. God is faithful. Harvest folk will know there's a promise that I have. But God gave me when I was first diagnosed, and God spoke and he said, I'm not going to heal you this time. And I have a long history of a variety of illnesses and accidents. Times when God had to step in miraculous power for me to be able to continue living in any real, meaningful way. But the promise I had when I was first diagnosed with the illness that sees me with this transplant is this time I won't heal you, but I'm going to give you the strength that you need. I'm going to give you the strength that you need. And God has been faithful in that. And so that was something that always I think about around about this time of year as I go through. Another journey around the sun is completed, another year that the doctors didn't imagine was possible, another year of living a life that God has provided in so many remarkable ways, such extraordinary blessing. But we passed another milestone this week. And earlier on today, I was just chatting with our dear friend Ian, and as we were talking, we were looking back at some of the videos on this channel, and I realized that we're coming up to the fifth year. We're about to start by this Sunday. We'll be into the fifth year since the first lockdown, the first going into isolation. The fourth anniversary by date actually is yesterday. But the first post that we put up, the first live stream that we did was actually a couple of weeks after that, on the 29th. I think it was around the 29th of March. You can check it on the channel. It's still up there if you go back through all the live videos. And so 4 years in, And for many people, life has returned to some sort of normality. And I bless God for that. If you're able to get on with your life in a normal way, I think that's fantastic. But because of my health and because of some of the other things that my illness mean for my immediate family, and particularly for my little lad, at the moment we are still living with incredible restriction. And so this afternoon I was just thinking about that and thinking about God's faithfulness. You know, during the last 4 years, when we couldn't do many of the things that we had been used to doing, we've still seen growth. We've still seen the opportunity to meet new people, wonderful new people. And I'm not going to name anyone. If I do, I might forget somebody, but more than that, I don't want to embarrass anyone, but people who have just brought such joy, such a blessing into our lives, people whose faithfulness, some of them whose newfound faith, has just been such an extraordinary blessing. And I'm so grateful to God that his purpose continues. But more than that, there is still a sense, a real clear, deep-seated understanding that we haven't finished yet. We haven't finished yet. Almost always when I come to these milestones, I think back to the character of Caleb in the Old Testament. Not because I think I'm anything like him, not because I think I'm either the sort of person who could do what he did or that I have the same sort of promises, but because of his testimony of God's faithfulness. You know, sometimes we're a little nervous of telling people what God will do, that telling people God is a healer, even though we know in our own experience that he is a miraculous, extraordinary healer. Sometimes we shrink back from telling people that God delivers, that God transforms, that God changes, that God provides, because those things have been co-opted by some pretty toxic traditions. We have to be careful that we don't hold back from saying what is true, that we are healed. I know in my experience, whenever I find myself needing to remember the faithfulness of God, I roll back my sleeve, or I roll up one of my trouser legs, and they reveal the scars from the time the car hit me when I was a teenager and I lost the use of both my left leg and my left arm. And I look back and I remember God's faithfulness. I remember that if God had not stepped in, my medical record still reports that the damage to my left shoulder is so severe that I'll never use it again. And yet by the faithfulness of God, here I am, and it's completely healed. I still remember the people who prayed for me, and one in particular, a man named Andrew, praying for me right where he had lost his own son to a road accident, but determined that God was faithful and God would heal, and God is faithful and God did. So I can't sit here and tell you that he doesn't. In fact, if anything, I ought to be telling you that he does. You might say, well, what if he doesn't? Well, as you've already picked up from what I've said this evening, there are times when he doesn't, but he is the strength and the grace to continue. It's what the experience of the Apostle Paul was. He said, many times I prayed the Lord would take away this thing, this thorn in my flesh, but his response was, my grace is sufficient for you. And we've got to remember that the promise of Jesus is abundant life. The promise of Jesus is life in all its fullness, and it's abundant by his standards, not necessarily ours. I want to tell you that his grace is sufficient, that his strength is enough, that when he promises to bring us through, he does. I can tell you that. People are nervous about talking about God who provides, and yet Jesus speaks about those who seek the kingdom, and he says, don't fret chasing after the practical things that the world chases after. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. He says, your loving heavenly Father knows what you need. And I would be failing to honor God if I did not say that he not only knows what we need, but he goes way beyond all that we could ask or imagine. I couldn't sit here and say that God had not provided faithfully all these years. This spring marks 20 years since I walked away from my old career. Not knowing where God would take me, but with a conviction that that was what I was supposed to do. And God has been faithful in all of his ways. God has never failed to meet every need. And he's expected us to play our part in that, and I'm extraordinarily blessed. By the way, we've been able to pursue it, and it's been possible because not only has God been faithful, but we've been able to do it together, Liz and myself, and her commitment to that vision has been extraordinary. And the work that she's put in, and just the grace of God on that. But God has been faithful. And as we've sought the kingdom, God has exceeded all that we could have asked or thought. So tonight, as I think about those milestones, I want to read this. Like Caleb declared on the day he finally reached the moment where he could say, okay, now, give me what you promised. Joshua 14, 10 to 12. Caleb says this, now behold, the Lord has kept me alive as he promised these 45 years, ever since the Lord spoke this word to Moses while Israel wandered in the wilderness. Now here I am this day, 85 years old. As yet I am as strong this day as on the day that Moses sent me. Just as my strength was then, so is my strength for war, both for going out and for coming in. Now, therefore, give me this mountain, of which the Lord spoke in that day. For you heard in that day how the Anakim were there, and that the cities were great and fortified. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. You know, our expectations are never in our own strength. When Caleb says my strength, it is now as it was then. He's not saying, look, I was a mighty man in my 40s. I'm going to be a mighty man in my 80s. What he was saying is, I was just as desperately in need of God then as I am now. But my God hasn't changed. You know, sometimes I look at our practical circumstances, and with all the different medical advances that are happening in dealing with COVID and dealing with my own illness and all the different things going on, I could say, well, maybe I'll get there. But it was never based on my strength or my ability anyway. All the good things that God has promised, they were never down to me. And the same is true for this amazing community that God has made us a part of. For Harvest, there are promises that God has given, and it was never down to us. It was always down to him. It was never going to rest in our wisdom or our ability or whether we could do it. It was always going to be God who had to do it. Our strength is now as it ever was. We are weak, but he is strong. We have no wisdom, but he is God only wise. And so Caleb, when he makes this declaration, he's not claiming that he was a great warrior in his 40s, so he will be in his 80s. No, he's saying, look, I was dependent then. I'm dependent now. God is my strength now as he was my strength then. What he sends me to, I'll complete. Where he calls me to go, I can walk with authority. What he's promised me, he will never fail. You see, God's faithfulness isn't circumstance dependent. When God makes his promises, he's fully aware of the day in which he's going to bring them about. God is not surprised by anything, and God is not shaken by anything. God's love and life are not diminished towards us because of what is going on in the world around us, or because of the limitations of our physical state or our mental state. God is able, and he's resolute, and he never fails. God doesn't dangle things in front of us, false hopes and expectations to motivate us and then dash our hopes. Every word that he says is true. It does not ever return to him void or empty. You said you'd give me the mountain, says Caleb. So do it then. The question is, why does he say now? Why does he say now, give me this mountain? Well, it's because his mountain taking day has come. You know, there are times when we have very precious promises from God. There are things that God says he's going to do in our lives, and they are not for that season. They are for a season yet to come. And in the meantime, there is purpose. In the meantime, there is a journey to be made. There is just purpose in our relationships. There's purpose in the kingdom. There's things that God calls us to, things to bless us, things to bless others, things to achieve his purpose, things to make us those who share in his kingdom. But there comes a day for which the promise was given. There comes a day when God says, now. There comes a day when the other work is ended. There comes a day when we're in the right place. There comes a day where all the different things that God has been aligning, been setting up, ready for our victory, are prepared. And the question comes to us in that day, will we say now? Or will we say, well, it's a bit late, really? Will we have the same joy in the promise that we had when he gave it? Will we have the same certain hope in his ability that we had at the beginning? Will we still depend on him? But will we still be confident in what he can do? You see, even if every fear is real, God is our unfailing strength. That's the thing about Caleb and Joshua. When they went into the land with the spies and they saw the mountains that we now know as Hebron, and we saw they saw the things that were waiting for them, the good things, but also the enemies. They saw the giants in the land. They saw the great fortified cities. They saw actually that the land itself required skills and abilities that they would not have. The spies weren't wrong when they said this is a land that consumes the people that live in it. Joshua and Caleb weren't thinking about the circumstances. They didn't say, don't be silly, we didn't see any giants. Don't be silly, there weren't any cities, because there were giants and there were cities. Their response was, but if God is with us, you know, there comes a moment when it's not enough to have the promise anymore. God expects you to lay hold of it. When it's not enough to believe that God can anymore, because God is calling you to actually go and do it. There comes a moment when God speaks and says, now. And in that moment, it doesn't mean that all the things that are impossible for you have suddenly become possible. It just means that they were never impossible with God. And so now is the moment for you to depend on him and to live in the fullness of what he has spoken to you. Now is the moment for a courage. It doesn't lie and say, look what I can do. It says, look what God has promised. He's able. He's faithful. That's what Caleb says. You've kept me all these years. My strength is now as it was then. So now that the journey is done, now that the obedience is completed, now that those other purposes are fulfilled, now that you declare this is the season in which you're going to fulfill this promise, now give me that mountain. You know, it may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but I am absolutely confident that every promise God ever spoke in my life, in the lives of the community of faith that we call Harvest Church, and actually whoever you are, every promise that God has for you, every mountain he said will be yours. Your mountain taking days will come. They absolutely will come, because if God has spoken it, he is faithful and he doesn't fail. And no matter whether they come when you feel strong and powerful and confident, or when they come where everything seems impossible, no matter whether they come when you feel like you can do it, or they come when you really understand that you can't, the strength of your life, well, if it's Jesus, if he is your hope and your power, if it's his commitment to you on which you depend, and when those mountain taking days come, you can say, now, Lord, give me what you promised. Give me what you promised. Give me what you promised in your word. Give me what you've spoken to my heart in my life. Because God, if you are with me, I will still be able to lay a hold of everything that you offer. Like I said, this week has been a week of thinking over God's faithfulness, of God's power, of being grateful, so grateful for the people in my life who've shared this journey with me. So grateful for all of God's keeping power, all of God's healing power, all of God's grace and provision. But the story isn't over yet. And so no matter that the doctors, well, they still think there's no possibility I can go on much longer, is there? No matter that the circumstances make it look almost impossible to bring about any of the things that I imagined the promises of God would look like. Those things that God has spoken, he surely will perform. They'll be perfect in their moment, and I won't miss them because God was relying on me. Because when I'm fully reliant on him, he is surely going to bring it to pass. And my prayer for you, if you know what it is to live with the promise God has given you, is that he'll give you strength to be faithful and confidence in him, so that when your mountain taking days come, you'll be able to lay hold of that promise with great joy and to occupy all that he has laid aside for you. And if you don't know what it is yet, to have that promise, to have that sense of God's purpose in your life, then I pray that you'll be brave enough to seek him, that you'll have the courage to put your trust in him, to look to him, to define your future, to define your life, that you'll read his promises and his word, and that you'll seek him by his Spirit to speak into your own experiences, specific things, the good works before ordained that you should walk in them, and that walking hand in hand with Jesus for you too. Days of promise, days of awe, days of seeing the goodness of God will come. Everybody who depends upon Jesus, who calls upon his name, everybody has a purpose in God, and it rests not in our strength but in his. My prayer for you is that your mountain taking days, your promises fulfilled, will come with great joy, and that you'll know now that he is your strength, so that when those days come, you'll know that he will still be your strength, just as he is, breath by breath, moment by moment, through every season of life. That's our thoughts for this evening. Lord bless you. God willing, we'll see you next week.